Salute BookTube. Welcome to my channel. Thank you for being here. Well, it's February. It's already February in 2026. The year is moving apace. And I thought I'd make a video now discussing the books that I read in January of 2026. The new year always springs into focus, new reading goals, new reading plans, and I certainly had my number of them. And I'm happy to say that I've launched it on a strong with a strong start. So yeah, that's what I thought I would do in this video is discuss the books that I read. Um, just one thing I want to mention before I do start. Just towards the end of January, I got kind of busy. Um, and so I was able to read, but I wasn't able to do as much booktubing, watching booktube videos as I wanted. So I'm a bit behind on that. So for you booktubers out there who see me commenting late, if I uh, comment on one of your videos, it's because I'm catching up. But anyway, with that said, like I mentioned, my reading wasn't too badly affected. I was able to keep a pace and read what I hoped to read for the month of January. So with that, we can start with the books I read. The first one we want to mention is a book that was given to me as a gift by Angelina. Her channel, Books Do Things to Me, sent me this book. It's Russian Magic Tales from Pushkin to Platonov. And it is edited and translated by Robert Chandler, although there are other translators, including his wife, um, Elizabeth Chandler, and then there's also other translators, Syblan Forster, Anna Gwynn, and Olga Mearson. So this book, Angelina sent to me at the end of 2025. I had set out just on video out loud, had mentioned that perhaps I would get into, or I was hoping to get into Russian literature sometime in the near future. I thought 2026, because I had already committed to a lot of reading projects, I thought might be a bit tough to do it. Also, I'm a little bit OCD when I start a whole new reading project. I like to do it, I don't know, maybe it's the history fan in me. I like to do it in chronological order. So I started asking for advice on BookTube. Where should I start? Who should I start with? Should I go in chronological order? With the old Russian writers, and then move forward towards more modern writers, all that kind of stuff. Overthinking it. And Angelina she sent this as a kick in the butt to say just start anywhere, do anything. And this was an inspired choice because this isn't the classics of Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or anybody like that. These are magic tales, just peasant folk tales that have been collected by Russian writers and put into words, and now translated in this very attractive Penguin Classics into English by Robert Chandler and his colleagues. And this was great. I really enjoyed reading these. These are very short, just folk tales, fairy tales. In the title, they use magic tales. There's a lot of magic and fantasy in these stories, but they're very short, but there are many of them because Russia, from what I learned about this, has a rich history of fairy tales. In fact, I think I read it in one of the introductions to the sections of this book, or maybe the main introduction of this book. The Russians start seeing the Germans, for example, with their Grimm fairy tales and other fairy tales, gaining popularity, and said to themselves, wait a second, we have an even richer fairy tale tradition, and we should really set it down in words, on paper, just set it down, because it was a much more oral culture. This was, again, these stories were told in Russian villages by Russian peasants as a form of entertainment and maybe lessons. But then, we can say from the 19th century onward was formalized and put into paper, pen and ink, into words. So just fascinating. Yeah, these are fairy tales, but you learn so much about Russia and about Russian culture, the Russian mindset, just Russian society. Again, a lot of these are peasant stories, peasant folk tales. So you learn a lot about Russian peasants, and you learn a lot about, that Russia was really a vast agricultural country. A lot of these stories, there's a lot of animals in these stories. So you got a lot of cows, you got a lot of birds, you get horses, you get just the things you'd expect from the countryside, fish, frogs, snakes, um, what else? Pigs. Just there's a lot of that, and then there's a lot of, a lot of the produce. There's a lot of food in here, a lot of butter, a lot of cheese, a lot of bread. Uh, um, just you get a picture of Russia that maybe you wouldn't have got if you had started with some of those classics, or with some of the more modern Russian stuff, when Russia actually becomes a much more industrial country. These were written when Russia was industrializing, but they are stories, collected stories from a very ancient past. So I was very happy to start with this as my introduction to Russian literature, because it puts, I don't know how to explain it, puts it into context. Whatever I read next, however you want to understand Russia, I'm grateful to Angelina for making me start with this. It's not terribly complex, very simple stories, but it gets into the mind of Russia, or helps you understand Russia and Russian literature. So with this one down, I can continue into February and onwards in 2026 to do some more classical Russian authors, hopefully. We'll see. Stay tuned for my TBR video for my February reading plans. So that was that part. The first projects for 2026, or one of the projects, was Read Russian Literature. That's off and running. The second big event I committed to for 2026 was Historathon. For those who don't know, Historathon is a year-long reading project where you're encouraged to read nonfiction history. I take a wider view of that. I'll include biographies in there, but again, the idea is to focus on nonfiction and specifically history, and it's divided into 4 quarters, and the 4 quarters are periods of history, and you're encouraged to read history from that period. So quarter one, which we're very much in, January, February, March, is begins at the beginning of time up to 500 AD or CE. That's the time frame, pretty much prehistory as well as antiquity, what is known as the ancient or antiquity. So for this year, I decided to focus on one specific subject, and that's the Phoenicians. I read this book. It's by Mark Wolmer. This is a short history of, it's the IB Tauris, famous academic publisher, and this is their short history of series. They've got a bunch of books about different historical subject matter, but I had this one, the Phoenicians, and I thought this was the best one to start my exploration of Phoenician history, because this focuses on the early Phoenicians. And when I say early Phoenicians, let's just find the map. I should have done this earlier, but if we go to the earlier, to the maps, the Phoenicians is this. That's the Mediterranean Sea. That's the historical homeland of Phoenicia. And that's pretty much, you've got Cyprus there. Phoenicia is pretty much what is present-day Lebanon, the nation state of Lebanon. Even the cities, Tyre, Beryutus, which is Beirut, Tripolis, which is Tripoli, what was the other one? Sidon, Byblos, all these cities, they've been Arabized, but those same cities exist in Lebanon today. You can visit Lebanon and you'll see that the cities have the same name. The one thing you won't see when you go to Lebanon is a lot of artifacts of the Phoenicians. There's a dearth of artifacts when compared to other ancient civilizations. For example, the Egyptians, or the Romans, or the Greeks, or the Mesopotamians, or others. And there's a reason for that. Uh, the reasons for that is there's not a lot of surviving literature of the Phoenicians, almost none. The second one is just it has to do with Lebanon's geography. Lebanon is a very small country, and it's a very narrow country. It's a narrow strip of land. You've got the coast, then you've got the narrow strip of land where most of the Lebanese cities are. Then you have mountains. So most of the Lebanese cities are hemmed in between the sea and the mountain, and that has made that has led to Lebanon always building on top of each other. So it's very hard to excavate. Like I mentioned, the cities like Beirut, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, all of them are still inhabited cities, habitable cities in the present time. So there's that. There's a dearth of literature, and then there's some unique aspects of the Phoenicians that I learned reading this book. This was a really good introduction, very well written, very easy for the beginner, not very complicated. But I have a couple of notes here because this book is small. I finished it early in the month, so I've got some notes just to remind me of some of the main points. The first one is, as I mentioned, we have a dearth of archaeological. We don't have that much archaeological, and we have very little written sources. And what Mark Wolmer does here, some of the sources he uses, probably the biggest source of the Phoenicians is actually the Bible. He uses the Bible. There's the Book of Kings and the Book of, I think it's Jeremiah. There are books, part of the Old Testament that mentions Tyre. It mentions King Hiram. It mentions the Phoenicians. It mentions the relations between King Solomon and King David with the Phoenicians. And he uses that. He also uses Homer's Iliad as a source because Homer's Iliad mentions the Phoenicians. So I found that very interesting. As I mentioned, the land, the narrow nature of the land of Lebanon. Although we don't have a lot of artifacts from Lebanon itself, of Phoenician artifacts, a lot of the artifacts I learned reading this was outside of Lebanon. So we have a lot of Phoenician artifacts in Cyprus. We have Phoenician artifacts in Greece, places like Athens, etc., Rhodes, Crete. We have artifacts in Italy. We've got artifacts in as far as Sardinia and Spain. And of course, we have artifacts in Africa. And I'll get to Africa because the Phoenicians ultimately started to spread and build colonies or trading outposts in northern Africa and places like Tunisia with Carthage, most well known, but other places in like Morocco, Algeria, Libya. There's a Tripoli in Libya, just like there's a Tripoli in Lebanon, for example. So that's another interesting fact. The other interesting thing Mark Wolmer again, or scholars of Phoenicia use that I found interesting, because of the lack of artifacts, they used to understand the Phoenician land, what is today Lebanon. What they used was they mentioned sociological research into 19th and 20th century, 100, 150 years ago. They studied Lebanese peasant villages and communities to help understand what the Phoenicians were like. That Lebanon has changed very little in the last, 3,000 years, pretty much, 2,000 years. No more, 2,500 years. That there were still similar practices, again, because of the dearth of knowledge. using 19th and 20th century, observing 19th and 20th century Lebanese village life to understand the Phoenicians. That was very interesting. And then finally, just one more thing about the Phoenicians. They were famous for being traders, businessmen, businesswomen, I guess, business people, traders, and they were a sea power, very much a sea power. In contrast, again, their land was very slim, very narrow, not exactly wide-ranging. It's a narrow spit of land, basically. So they always oriented to the sea and became a sea power, great sea power, and were trading throughout the Mediterranean, as I mentioned, starting or opening trading entrepôts all over the Mediterranean, all the way to Spain, Cadiz in Spain, Carthage, of course, in Tunis, as far as Morocco, probably Mauritania, Algeria, Libya, and also in Sicily, Sardinia, Malta, probably Cyprus, all these places, Anatolia, which is now Turkey, all these places the Phoenicians penetrated. And this book, just if you look at the table of contents, chapter 1 is historical overview, chapter 2 is government and society, chapter 3 is religion, chapter 4 is art and material culture, and then chapter 5 is overseas expansion. But in the chapter of overseas expansion, there's no mention, there's one thing that's not mentioned, and that's war, armies, defense. None of that is mentioned, which is interesting. The Phoenicians were not a warlike culture, they were a trading culture. There's a quote here just near the end of the book. I'd like to read it just to give you an understanding. It says, in contrast to the Greeks who colonized Sicily in order to gain direct control of its agricultural land and resources, the Phoenicians settled on the island because its location allowed them to dominate the newly established markets and trade routes in North Africa, Italy, and Iberia. By adopting a commercial rather than a colonial strategy when dealing with their indigenous neighbors, the Phoenicians were able to acquire the agricultural resources needed by their settlements without having to seize control of large swaths of territory. Moreover, by establishing symbiotic relationships that were based on peaceful coexistence and trade rather than on power and dominance, the Phoenicians successfully encouraged cultural tolerance, exchange, and assimilation, a situation evinced by the blending of funerary rites and traditions, the prevalence of cross-cultural marriages, and the merging of artistic style and traditions. That's a good summation of the Phoenicians. Again, traders, not grand armies. Again, Lebanon is a small country, very little agricultural potential because of the nature of the geography. They always had to import food. They were a great naval power. They were great traders. So, again, very fascinating ancient culture. But of course, as we know, as history goes on, the Phoenicians start a colony or a trading outpost in North Africa and specifically in Carthage. And that leads to the next book, which is this by B.H. Warmington. It's Carthage, a History. Sorry about the glare. This is an older book from the 1960s, but was still quite readable. And then it picks off where this ends. This is the Phoenicians of Lebanon. These are their ancestors in Carthage, the Punic Carthage people whose ancestry goes back to the Phoenicians of Lebanon. Again, they have the similar gods as the Phoenicians in Lebanon, the similar trade business outlook as the Phoenicians in Lebanon, the same related language, culture, all kinds of things, but especially that trade aspect, that naval power that Carthage was, great Mediterranean naval power. And this is where it picks off. But as Carthage grows and becomes, because Carthage is in what is today Tunisia, it's very much in the middle of the Mediterranean world. It's like right there. But that peaceful trading coexistence type of existence type of civilization was not able to endure. They had to become more militaristic. The control of Sicily, which if you control Sicily, you control both the Eastern Mediterranean and the Western Mediterranean, and the Carthaginians, especially in Spain, and had control of Spain because Spain had rich minerals. The control of Sicily attracted other more warlike civilizations, most notably the Greeks, and then much more noticeably the Romans. Both of them very materialistic, very bent on domination, especially the Romans more than the Greeks. And that led Carthage and that Phoenician sort of peaceful civilization of trade and negotiating, etc., that had to change to defend their interests against an encroaching, first of all, Greek expansion into southern Italy, and then the growth of Rome and the Punic Wars with Hannibal and all that stuff. One thing I found interesting in this book, again, it's an older book, but there was the discussion of, everybody knows the Persian invasion of Greece, the 300, the Persian Empire, the large Persian Empire against the small Greek city-states. One interesting thing was very few people know that at the same time, the Greeks also repelled the Carthaginian attack on Sicily, right on the same day, I believe, as the Persians invaded, or the same year. I don't know if it goes as close as the year, but it was an organized. It seems obvious that it was an organized two-pronged attack. That the Persians would attack the Greeks in the Greek mainland and Greece proper, and the Carthaginians would attack the Greeks in Sicily. The Persian navy that lost to the Greeks at Salamis, I think is the name of the battle, was mostly what Warmington suggests here, and which is probably accepted, were mostly Phoenician navy, because Phoenicia had the strongest navy in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so, there's that connection. The other interesting thing is Carthage always had loyalty to its original Phoenician forebears in Lebanon. The interesting thing is they never really adapted the very rich Greek culture. They never, they took from it, but they never totally assimilated, much less than, say, Rome. Rome also had its separate institution, but they were institutions and culture, but they took a lot from Greece. The Carthaginians didn't. They kept to their ancient Phoenician Semitic roots really to the end. And yeah, that's that switch from being a more Pacific, much more trading, much more business focused empire rather than a warlike empire, and then the change. We start from that beginning to great generals like Hannibal. This book ends with Hannibal, the Great Punic Wars, the thousands and thousands that were killed, and finally the tragic loss of Carthage to the Romans. Warmington, he takes a very Carthaginian stance in this book. He's very anti-Roman, very sympathetic to Carthage in this book. He makes it very clear when you read this book how clear it is. But there's just two more things before we wrap up about the Phoenicians and Carthage, because I've got other books about Phoenician Carthage that I hope, or mostly Carthage, which I hope to read in February. There's just two things. First of all, when talking about Phoenicians and their business focus, their business savvy, their economic intelligence, their trading culture. Anybody who knows the current Lebanese, at least people in the Middle East, and for those who don't know, I'm based in the Middle East, in the United Arab Emirates. But in Lebanon, and this is known throughout the Middle East, the Lebanese are known as great businessmen. They're the great facilitators of trade between the Western world and the Middle East, at least historically, although it's still true, because a good 50% of them are Christian. They're able to, but they speak Arabic, so they're able to bridge the gap between the Christian West and the Arab East or Islamic East. Um, so they're to this day they're very well known businessmen. I just wanted to highlight that the more things the more things change, the more they stay the same when you read history. But the other thing is about the what was the other thing I just I sort of blanked. Oh, the other thing is I had mentioned when I announced that I'll be reading this earlier in January, the beginning of January. I had said that there was rumors that the Phoenicians and then the Carthaginians, after they had settled North Africa, crossed the Iberian Peninsula and went north all the way. There are reports they went to Iceland and England, Britain. Now, I don't know if there's any artifacts that have been found to prove this. So I think those are rumors. But as I read here, what we do know, and this is probably a bit of my Eurocentric brainwashing. What we do know, and what is mentioned in this book by Warmington, is that there was there was a Punic expedition that crossed the Iberian Peninsula but went south and went into West Africa, places like the most southern point Warmington mentions is probably the Senegal River, which is well into, after Saharan Africa, well into the heart of Africa, for lack of a better term. So there for gold, mostly the Phoenicians took that African gold, African ivory, African animals, and then traded it throughout the Mediterranean as luxury goods at great profit. And again, for those of you who don't know the Lebanese community, there's a large Lebanese community in North Africa to this day who, if I'm not mistaken, one of them is married to Donald Trump's daughter. He's a Lebanese, he's an African of Lebanese origin who was based in Ivory Coast or Senegal, something like that. There's a big Lebanese community in West Africa to this day. And the same is true. There's big Lebanese communities in South and North America. Again, quite prosperous, good business people, just like the Phoenicians. So that was that one. And then the final two books I read was in conjunction to my own little reading plan I made for the 250th anniversary of the United States of America, America's 250th birthday. That's in the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, July 4th. And July 4th, 2026, America will officially be 250 years old. So for that, and because I have so many books about American history and I want to narrow it down, I want to read the books that I don't need to keep in my library, the undesirables. I want to read them and get rid of them. I thought, what better time than the 2026 250th anniversary of America to start reading these books. The problem with that is, as anybody knows, America's history, even if you want to start at Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World, that's in 1492. If we round it up just a couple of years, that's up to 1500, and that's so 1500 onwards is when American history, with the notable exceptions of the indigenous Indian nations, with that major exception, that's really when modern American history starts. And that means that for Historathon, if we want to fit into Historathon, that's not until Q3. So there's really not much American history other than native history to read about prior to 1500. And even the native history, a lot of it is what happens after, that's recorded, that happens after, when the European settlers came in and just the ravaging of the native indigenous culture. So I have the whole first half of 2026, and I didn't want to waste it waiting for the second half to read about American subjects. So I had decided for the first part of 2026, I'd read American books about America, American politics, American society, some investigative journalistic um, books about America. And these are books I have in my library that, again, I don't need to keep. I want to read and get rid of. Unless it's really good, I'll keep. But for the most part, these are books that can probably be sacrificed in the interest of space in my library. Because despite this big amount of bookshelves, I'm still lacking in space. So I read two books, and these are two books that are. How do we put this? These are by neocons, neoconservatives at the height of the neoconservative ascendancy in America. This was George W. Bush at the George W. Bush presidency, the Iraq War. Well, after September 11th, the Iraq War, that period. The first book I read is by a non-American. I think he's becoming an American, but he's a Canadian author. The book is called America Alone: The End of the World as We Know It. The author is Mark Stein. And in this book, you can see he's got all these Islamic flags, and you've got only America's flag alone standing there. Mark Stein argues that demographics is destiny, that the number of Muslims, the Muslim population throughout the world, and especially in Europe, is growing and growing, while European birth rates are plummeting. And basically what Mark Stein is positing, or posits in this book, because this book is old, this isn't a recent book, it's from 2006. What he posits is that Europe, the European continent, the European civilization is declining, and will be taken over by Muslims eventually. And that means that America is flying the flag of Western civilization alone, and then American Christian America, or America traditional values, America, freedom, whatever, that is going to be America is going to be alone fighting the Islamic menace, because Europe is impotent, basically. So that's what this book is about. I could say a lot about this, but I'll give Mark Stein. He's a funny author. He's a comedic author. I think he got his. I was reading. He got his start writing theater reviews, reviews of Broadway theatrical performances. But now he's very much writing about geopolitics, etc. So I think that background gave him his sort of funny, his funny prose. That's what stood out to me the most. As for the actual arguments, you can get into it, but perhaps in the interest of time, but also not to anger anybody, we'll keep it. We won't delve into that. The other book I read was another a prominent neoconservative, neocon author, Jonah Goldberg. This is Liberal Fascism. Sorry about the glare there, but you can see the title has the hippie smiley face with a Hitler mustache, and then the subtitle. Let's just get it in focus there. The Secret History of the American Left, from Mussolini to the Politics of Meaning. And what Jonah Goldberg does here, he argues that fascism, Mussolini, Hitler, mostly Mussolini, but Hitler also, the fascist movements in Europe influenced American progressivism, which influenced the American left wing throughout the 20th century. So if we go look at the chapters, so there's an introduction on Mussolini and Adolf Hitler where he tries to define what fascism is, and then he tries to see how it's the left, not the American right, not the right wing of America, not conservative America, not the Republican Party, but the Democratic left that adopted a lot of the ideas of Mussolini and Hitler and the fascists in Europe. So we look at chapter 3, it's Woodrow Wilson and the birth of liberal fascism. Chapter 4 is Franklin Roosevelt, the fascist New Deal. Chapter 5 is the 1960s, fascism takes to the streets. Chapter 6 is from Kennedy's myth to Johnson's dream, liberal fascism and the cult of the state. And then he has another chapter about eugenics, which he argues the American lefts very much supported the progressives. Liberal fascist economics, which is, we'll get there. And then the rest of the book, the concluding book, argues that Hillary Clinton is a political inheritor of Mussolini and fascism, to an extent Adolf Hitler too. Although he's much more nuanced in his arguments. He doesn't say they're all, they're not all Hitler, but they're fascists. Again, the obsession with Hillary Clinton. This book, again, it's an older book. This is the height of this book is at the height of the neoconservative ascendancy in America. 2007. So Barack Obama his name comes up once here, but there's a whole chapter on Hillary Clinton. This was the right wing, the neocons, focusing their attack on who they thought would be the Democratic nominee. They all thought it would be Hillary Clinton, and that wasn't the case. But what else to say about this book? Again, you can argue with this book because this is very much an ideas book. What did I want to say? I mean, you can. There was obviously the 1920s and the early 20th century. Yes, there was a lot of confusion. It was a time of great change. Airplanes, communications, telephones, modernity, and it was very hard. There was a lot of new ideas coming about: communism, fascism, progressivism, all that kinds of stuff. But you can make the case that there was some similarities with Woodrow Wilson in the 20s, with Mussolini. Yes, because they lived at the same time. But the argument gets weaker and weaker. You can't compare, Lyndon Baines Johnson to Adolf Hitler. It gets a bit confused. It gets more difficult to make that argument, let alone Bill and Hillary Clinton. That's where this book kind of he's good. Goldberg is good at the beginning of comparing, the 1920s and the early progressive era with European ideas. But then as it gets into the 60s and 70s, it becomes partisan. This is a partisan hack. He's a writer. He's the manager. What is he? He's the columnist for London, contributing editor to National Review. So he wakes up every day from 9 to 5 or from 8 to 6 or 7 to 7. All he's doing is thinking about the left, how to attack the left, and it shows. This book it's a partisan attack, just very partisan, from somebody who does it for a living, who defends the right and attacks the left for a living, in words. So that aspect there. The other thing, 2007. Well, there's two things. First of all, the word he attacks FDR and the New Deal as some kind of fascist political project. Like all the right, it takes him many pages before the words Great Depression, make an appearance. He talks as if the Great Depression never even existed. FDR just wanted power, and he was a power-hungry politician, but the Great Depression, something had to be done. The state had to intervene because people were on breadlines. The same thing, this book was written in 2007. Well, what happened in 2008? Because the chapter on liberal fascist economics, the conservative, the right-wing, the libertarians keep the state out of business, keep, business and government separate. The free hand, Adam Smith, the free hand of the capitalist system. In 2008, what happened? There was a financial crisis under George W. Bush's watch, the subprime mortgage crisis, the banks and all kinds of lending houses were going bankrupt. And what did George W. Bush and his administration do? The state went in and bailed out the banks. So the big arguments of the neocons, they lost a lot of credibility with the execution of the war in Iraq especially, but that's another subject, not discussed here. But for the economics, that took a big hit. The economic crisis and the response to that, the state had to intervene. If it was a pure laissez-faire economic system, they should have let those pernicious lending houses, just die. But that would have meant a severe, not recession, but depression in the American economy. And then the right wing were pro-state intervention. But before that, it was, keep government out of business. But what else is there to say about this? I think there was one more point I wanted to make. I'm just trying to remember it. I should note this stuff down because this is a bigger book, one of the longer books I read this month. There was one thing he excludes. So he talks about, I mentioned the names Wilson, FDR, basically all the 20th century Democratic presidents. Wilson, FDR, then he goes into Kennedy and LBJ, then he goes into Clinton, and then the end is the attack on Hillary Clinton / Barack Obama. Hillary Clinton that became Barack Obama. There was one president who was excluded, interestingly enough, from the Democrat, probably the most left. I don't know. That's Jimmy Carter. Jonah Goldberg the word Jimmy Carter, the name Jimmy Carter doesn't appear once here. And I think his arguments about the Democratic left being influenced by progressive, or the progressive left wing being influenced by European fascism, he couldn't square. His argument would fall flat on its face if he had to mention Jimmy Carter. Maybe he excluded Jimmy Carter just because he was a decent guy, but also, Jimmy Carter was a Southern farmer, religious Democrat. He doesn't fit into the what he tries to argue. All the others did, but he didn't. And Goldberg, he brushes him off. So I thought that was also something to argue with. Again, you can argue with this book. These books are made to argue because they're partisan hack jobs. But I read it. It's a big book, takes a lot of space. I'm glad I read it. Maybe now I can get rid of it, and now I have a bit of space to put other books in its place. But yeah, that was my January reading plan. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you had a good January. Not my January reading plan, my January reading wrap-up. I hope you had a good January of reading, and I hope you have a good February of reading. I'll sign off. I'll very soon post my TBR, what I plan to read in February. But until then, BookTube, salute.